talking about lines. So lines actually my favorite element of design. It's kind of the most simple, but it's kind of the building block for pretty much all the other ones, which I think is really exciting. So the definition of line is a mark that has a length considerably greater than its width. So again, just anything longer than it is wide. I'm just getting my chat bubble up for you guys. So if you have questions, you can type in the chat. Perfect. So there's a few other words that we might talk about when we talk about line. So we have orientation, which is whether the line is horizontal, vertical, or diagonal. We also have direction, which is the implied movement of the line. So where does it look like the line is going? So in the first example on the left, we have the orientation of the lines would be vertical and horizontal. Direction, these lines to me feel pretty static, but you could kind of suggest that the lines look like they're moving down. Maybe these lines right here kind of look like they're moving down. These might look like they're moving up. These kind of white lines right here that are implied, they kind of look like they might be moving off to the side. Versus the one on the right, the orientation is diagonal, and the direction definitely feels like the lines are moving from the inside out or the outside in. But there's definitely a lot more action happening in the one on the right. Diagonal lines have a lot more energy than vertical or horizontal lines. So horizontal lines have the least amount of energy, followed by vertical, and then followed by diagonal. So there are clearly exceptions to this, but in general, diagonal lines always have a lot more energy. So that's just something to keep in mind if you want your piece to feel very lively, like it's there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of energy to it, you might use very diagonal lines. If you want something to feel very still, very calm, or if you're trying to give something a very stable feeling, like if you're designing a logo for a bank, you might want to use very vertical, very horizontal lines because it feels stable. You want these people to trust that they're giving their money to this bank and nothing weird's going to happen, versus if you're doing a logo for maybe like a dance company, you might use diagonal or even curvy lines to kind of give it some energy. So here are the calligraphic lines. So they're similar to handwriting. They can suggest motion and expression. So calligraphic lines tend to be very expressive because you can really see the movement of the wrist that was used to make it. You see that a lot in this right here. So calligraphic lines tend to get thick and thin. They also tend to get fuzzy on one end, kind of where you can imagine the wrist kind of flicking off. You definitely, they don't have to be wavy, like they can be straight. And so that's the thing, like they can be curl, they can be any type of line. Any type of line can be a calligraphic line, if that makes sense, or a calligraphic line can also be any type of line. They can be straight, they can be curvy, they can be implied, they can be broken, but the thing about them is that they are not carefully drawn. They always tend to show motion, the motion that was kind of behind making them. So in this example right here, you definitely get that sense of text, but you don't really see any readable text, but you see how the lines get thick and thin. They tend to have tails almost, and you can also see the line that kind of fades away and gets feathery at the end. Here, let me set my timer so I don't talk too long. Okay. Yeah, you could definitely see it in like Japanese or Chinese calligraphy. like the idea of using like a really big brush and getting really big gestures or movement. I'm not really familiar with ancient Korean art, so I should actually look that up. I'm much more familiar with Japanese art because I was a printmaking major. So all the old like Japanese woodcuts, like the ukiyo-e prints, I got to study those in college. So Cy Twombly was a famous modern artist. And I love these really big, drippy paintings. So the drips aren't necessarily what make it calligraphic, but they definitely add to that feeling of motion and expression. So you can really imagine the movement of his arm that he used to kind of make it. Yes, David, you can use a micron pen for these, definitely. The kind of boxes on the left, those definitely feel calligraphic, and they look like they're done with chalk, you know, so you don't necessarily need anything fancy like a calligraphy pen. It's basically trying to show the motion of the arm or the wrist that was used to make them. You even get a little bit of the calligraphic lines done in here. So how some of these lines trail off, especially right there, they tend to look really sketchy. And they also give, and when I say sketchy, I don't mean like, ooh, that guy's looking sketchy. I mean more like you're actually sketching with your hand. So they can actually also give the sense of motion, which is happening in this bird piece right here. Contour lines. So if anyone's taken a drawing class, you are probably familiar with contour lines. Contour lines essentially are outlines. A contour is the outline of an object. So a contour line is something that defines the outer edge of an object. They can sometimes suggest form, but not necessarily. So especially in like this shoe piece right here, just the contour of the shoelaces, you really get that concept of things moving and folding. With these people right here, you kind of go back and forth between, is it flat or is it dimensional? So contour lines are always the outline of an object, but they can suggest form. That brings us into the complicated one, which is cross contours. So cross contours are parallel lines that map the surface of an object, almost like a topographical map in a way is a good way to kind of think about that. They're lines that kind of stretch over an object, and they always suggest form. So you can really see that here in how, sorry, there's this hummingbird that keeps like zooming past my window, like looking at me, like I think he's trying to get my attention. So you can really see it in Lucky and how these lines kind of wrap over the surface of the hand, and it kind of gives you that impression that the hand is in 3 dimensions. You see that a lot in the ball that the hand is holding, how those lines kind of are stretched over, and it gives that ball form. And this one right here, you have these straight lines that shift to make it look like they're being stretched over an object, like they're popping out exactly. So cross contour lines, they're parallel. They can go in one or multiple directions. So they can just be parallel lines or like a grid. So think of like a globe, the latitude and longitude. Those are examples of cross contour lines. So here we have some example of contour and cross contour lines being used, and they definitely suggest form. I really love these paintings because they're very, very simple, but they look so complete. And you don't need that much detail to make something interesting. I think they're oil. I could be wrong. Like maybe the one on left could be watercolor, and I think the one on the right is oil or acrylic is what I would guess. But the one on the left could be watercolor. Organizational lines. So we're not going to be doing a thumbnail for this one, but I think the term organizational lines are good to know. They are lines that kind of create the linear skeleton of a piece. So the lines that you use to kind of organize your elements and kind of plan out where you're going to put things. Organizational lines tend to get erased, is kind of also how I like to think about them. They're almost like the sketch in a way. Sometimes they're really interesting though. There was this guy I went to grad school with, and he would make these really labor intensive paintings. He would basically go to like dilapidated buildings, like buildings falling apart, and he would paint them. Yeah, a rough sketch is a good way to think about that, David. And he would paint these buildings, but it would take him forever to paint them because they were very like hyper realistic, and he'd bring them to critique half finished. So you could see all his, like he used like 1 and 2 point perspective. So you could see all his perspective lines, and they looked so cool. Like we loved like seeing like these like half finished paintings with all these lines, and we'd say like, you're done, you don't need to do it anymore. And he'd be like, no, I have to finish it. And they'd all get covered up. But we like I loved seeing the paintings in that like half finished state. I thought they were so much more interesting. So it's kind of a good thing to think about. Sometimes the organizational lines add to the piece, but they do often get erased. Implied lines. Okay, this one is tricky. This and calligraphic lines are the tricky ones. So these suggest connection without actually connecting. So an implied line can be real or imagined, but the thing is the viewer's eye kind of connects it. So fair warning, don't draw this stupid triangle. I'm so sick of seeing this stupid triangle in people's thumbnails. Don't do it. But what this triangle is trying to show you is that you read this as a triangle. For most people do, at least, is they kind of just see a triangle. They don't necessarily see like 3 little like baby shark hands. You know, you don't read it as that. You read it as a triangle because of the implied line. Here's a great example of an implied line, like a dotted line like this. That is a line that is not solid, but your eye connects it and reads it as one. Exactly, David, good job. This right here, again, that kind of broken line. And then this is kind of more of a conceptual implied line. So just me pointing, I create an implied line because you follow the gaze of my hand. All right, so I'm going to throw this word at you because it's what's happening when you connect an implied line. It's called closure. So this has to do with line, but also has to do with other concepts of design, but I'm just kind of throwing it at you guys right now. Closure is when your brain connects fragmented imagery. So in this design on the right, the actual hair of the figure isn't finished, but your brain reads it as finished. You know, you don't really read that as some void of empty space. Like you actually see the rest of the hair. Same thing with the one on the left. There's no head on this figure. There's no body. There's just these shapes, but your brain really completes it. So you see those shapes as being the pattern of a dress or a shirt. And then you see the hair, all those kind of squiggly lines, you kind of read that as hair. So that's the idea of closure. So I'm going to do a little 2-minute break for you guys. And if you have any questions, you can ask them. So 2-minute break starting now. One more minute. Any questions? Or does anyone need to see a slide again? Okay, so I will continue. I'm just setting my alarm for 15 minutes so I don't talk too long. All right. Okay. So here are just some examples of line being used in art and design in different ways. So we have some straight lines being used here. They are diagonal, so they have a lot of energy, but they also kind of are contour lines in a way because they start to look like facets of a crystal, maybe. They definitely get broken in some areas where the paint kind of overlaps right there, but your brain still connects it. So we don't think that they're, you know, two separate lines. We kind of read them as connecting still. Here we have some non-straight lines, and they kind of definitely bring our eye down, and then these kind of bring our eye up, so we kind of have this like up and down motion happening. And here our eye kind of goes down, but then these lines kind of flick back up, so it kind of keeps your eye moving throughout the piece. Here we have lots of different types of lines. These lines right here actually are starting to be a little calligraphic. You see how they look kind of scribbly or sketchy even. They have that kind of fuzzy calligraphic nature. They definitely apply direction, so they make it feel like those trees are really big and looming. That's what gives it that almost creepy, ominous feel, like we are this person alone in the woods, or maybe the woods itself is like growing and going to like swallow them whole. And the one on the right, we have some implied lines with the little footsteps that lead up to the house. And then we also have some beautiful calligraphic lines that are used to imply texture in the wolves. So just those kind of beautiful fuzzy lines. And then you don't need to draw every single little tuft of fur. Just this kind of little shading right here gives us that idea that this is fur. So here's some examples of what your thumbnails might look like. So we have straight lines. So all of these are straight lines, but like I said, you can, they can definitely change direction and they would still count as straight lines. What's also really good in this is changing the line weight. So that's something I didn't talk about in the lecture, but line weight, how thick or thin a line is. So if everything is the same, that can get to be a little bit boring versus having some variation, some variety in there, some thick and thin lines. It makes it a lot more dynamic and a lot more interesting. You see that here as well, and how some of these lines get really, really thick and some stay thin. That makes it more engaging to look at. So these are the non-straight lines right here. Here are some beautiful calligraphic lines. So you see right here, this was done with a brush pen, and it gives it that kind of thick to thin. It gets kind of fuzzy at the edge. These right here were done with like the edge of a piece of charcoal. So they kind of just put the charcoal on its edge and kind of just shifted it back and forth to get that idea of a calligraphic line. Implied lines over here. So all these little kind of hatch marks, but they actually kind of create one line. These stippled marks right here, how they create a line. Here, what's really interesting is the implied line is happening in between the shapes. So the black shapes create a line in between them, but since the line isn't solid, it's a negative space. So that's why that one's implied. So here are some more examples of calligraphic line. They're still a little careful. So I like right here, I think these are very calligraphic versus these right here, I think are a little too carefully done, but I would still count them. I used to make my students do lines that implied movement. You guys don't have to do that. Here's some examples of what your thumbnails might look like. So this is what I mean where they can kind of touch, but they don't, they could have a space in between them as well. So here's some examples of other people's 200 line projects. These are calligraphic lines right here. So you see how they kind of get thick and then thin, and then there's some wispy ones in the back. They definitely look like they were kind of, you can see the motion of the wrist that was used to make them. And so again, don't copy these. Someone last semester did this exact one, like everything was exactly the same. So this means that you don't get to use any of these. Can I use some sort of highlighter for calligraphic lines? I would say keep it black. So if you had like a big black, like dry erase marker, you could use that. If it's in your thumbnails, you can use the highlighter, but not for the finished piece. I hope that makes sense. For the highlighters, you can do any type of material. My cat just came in. I'm trying to get her over so you guys can see it. There she comes, there she comes. Oh, you can just see her tail. So I think there's some more in here. This one right here I love because you get all that line variety, the thick lines and the thin lines and how they create the contour of this circle shape right here. So remember this, this project is about line, not shape. So you want everything that you do to reflect line. You still can create shapes, but what I wouldn't do is draw one big like black circle because that doesn't really talk about line versus this right here, kind of creating that shape through line.
The picture on the left, is that more abstract or representational? Because it looks much like a tree. So would that be still considered non-representational?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that. So for this project, I was really, really strict. Like they couldn't have anything representational at all. And she wanted to draw like a tiny person on a flower. And we went through several iterations. And then this is what she came to, abstracting it. So I can see it, but it's like she had the legs right here, and then she wanted like this honey to be dripping down. So it was based on something representational, but we went through a lot of iterations to kind of abstract it. So to you, you're like, I kind of see a tree, which is why I would say it's definitely abstract because you can kind of recognize things, but Callie, stop. You can kind of recognize things, but you kind of can't put your finger on it. So I would say that one's abstract. And then here are some other examples. So this one is great because something that it does well is it really uses the space of the design. There's a lot of negative space in this one, but everything still feels very finished. So the number one suggestion I give on this piece is two. I'm gonna give you two. The two biggest suggestions I give on this piece is you needed more variety in your line weight and you have too much negative space. So You are only allowed to use 200 lines, which sounds like a lot, and it's not. People always wish they could add more lines. They get to 200, and then they have to like think, okay, what line can I erase to add one here? So 200 lines goes by really, really fast. So think about how you are engaging the space of the composition. So you want to use all that space possible, and you want to make sure it's as balanced as it can be. So a typical rule, and this is like a rule that you can definitely break, I break it all the time, but when you're working with black and white, you want about 50% black, 50% white, maybe 60-40. But for this piece, that's really hard to get because you're using line. So you might be more 30-70 or 20-80. But what you don't want is a ton of white space, because white space makes something feel unfinished. So in this one right here, this person really used all the space in the design. But this one right here has a ton of negative space and it works. So sometimes negative space can work, but sometimes it can make a piece feel unfinished. This one is very balanced between the negative space and the positive space. This one has a ton of negative space. I think a little bit more line variety, some more kind of areas with thicker black lines would have helped it. This one feels pretty balanced. This one has a lot of negative space, but again, it works. So those are just some things to kind of think about as you are designing your piece.